Humanity's ruthless counterattack left the Galactic Council speechless. The first thing I saw when I walked onto the command deck was 5,000 enemy ships. Not on a screen. Not on a map. Through the actual viewport. A wall of metal stretching from horizon to horizon, blotting out the stars, filling the sky above Earth like a ceiling made of iron and fire. Their hull lights pulsed in slow waves, red and violet, like something breathing. Something alive. Something that had already decided it had won. I am Commander Yael Moran. I have been stationed aboard Earth's orbital defense platform Alpha for 3 years. In that time, I had run 400 drills, reviewed 9,000 threat simulations, and drank enough bad coffee to fill a small lake. Nothing in any of those drills looked like this. Lieutenant Owen Price was already at his console when I arrived. He was 26 years old, sharp, fast with numbers, and usually unshakable. Right now, his hands were very still on the keyboard, and he was not typing anything. He was just looking at the viewport. "How long?" I asked. "They came out of fold space 41 minutes ago," he said. 5,217 vessels. The smallest ones are twice the size of our heaviest cruiser. The flagship is roughly the size of Greater London. I stood next to him and looked at the flagship. He was not exaggerating. It hung in the center of the formation like a small moon. Its hull was layered, dark, covered in sensor arrays and weapon ports that I had only seen in classified intelligence files. The Vreth Dominion had been building that ship for 60 years. They had named it the Sovereign Voice of the Eternal Order. We had been calling it the Problem for the last decade. The comm channel opened with a tone that rattled every speaker on the deck. It was not a polite tone. It was the kind of tone you use when you are not asking for attention. You are demanding it. "Attention, Earth Command. This is High Admiral Vrenkata of the Vreth Dominion, speaking on behalf of the Galactic Council's enforcement arm. You have been formally assessed as a Category 4 destabilizing species. Under Council Resolution 1119, you are hereby given 72 hours to surrender all sovereign territorial claims beyond your home system, dismantle your deep space fleet, and submit to administrative oversight. Failure to comply will result in corrective action." The channel closed. No pleasantries. No room for questions. Owen looked at me. "Corrective action," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them deeply unpleasant. "That's what they're calling it," I said. Across the station, I could hear people moving. Consoles lighting up. The low hum of the station shifting from standard operations to full alert status. In the corridors below, I knew the evacuation protocols were already in motion. Politicians and civilian staff were being directed to the deep shelters beneath the station's core. The bureaucrats were going underground. That was fine. That was where they belonged right now. What I noticed, and what I remember clearly, was that none of my people left the deck. Not one. Senior Engineer Clara Hobbs, 44 years old, former deep space mining technician, now in charge of our power distribution grid, simply pulled up her diagnostics panel and started running efficiency checks. She did not say a word. She just got to work. Navigation Officer Ben Holt, 31, who had a habit of tapping his left knee when he was thinking hard, was tapping his knee very hard right now, staring at the formation patterns of the incoming fleet, running calculations I had not yet asked for. Communications Specialist Grace Farrow had already opened 4 simultaneous encrypted channels and was quietly documenting everything the Vreth fleet was broadcasting, sorting it, tagging it, archiving it. She was recording history with the same calm expression she used when filing routine maintenance reports. These were my people. And they were not running. The second transmission came 18 minutes later. This one was not from the Vreth. It was from Ambassador Quelsier of the Galactic Council, transmitted on a public frequency. He was not even bothering with a private channel. He wanted everyone to hear. His voice was smooth. Almost kind. That was the part that irritated me most. "Commander Moran. I understand this moment must feel overwhelming. The Council wishes you to know that the terms offered are generous. You have a remarkable species. Emotional, creative, quite adaptable. The Council has no desire to see humanity diminished. We simply require that you operate within appropriate boundaries. Compliance is the rational choice. I urge you to counsel your leadership accordingly." He paused, and then, very quietly, just before the channel closed, he added, "Bravery without capacity is simply theater." He said it like a conclusion. Like it was already settled fact. I saved the recording. The formal reply from Earth's Unified Command was transmitted at exactly the 1-hour mark. I had reviewed the draft before it went out. It was calm, measured, and professional. It acknowledged receipt of the ultimatum. It requested clarification on several technical points in the Council's resolution. It asked for an extension of the response deadline to allow for full governmental review. It used words like collaborative framework and mutual understanding. It was, in every way, the response of a civilization that was afraid. That was the point. Owen looked at me after he read the outgoing transmission on his screen. He was too smart not to notice the gap between what the message said and what I knew was already happening. He had seen the expression on my face when the ultimatum first came through. He had seen that I was not afraid. He had seen that I was waiting. "Commander," he said carefully. "Is there something happening that I don't have clearance to know about yet?" I looked at the 5,000 ships outside the viewport. I looked at the flagship, the size of a city, that had crossed the galaxy to intimidate a species it had decided was manageable. "Yes," I said. Should I be worried? I thought about the conversation I had 3 days ago with Admiral Patricia Shinobi, before she was admitted to the medical wing with the heart condition she had been ignoring for 2 years. I thought about what she had said, in that quiet, direct way she had, while looking at a star map with her hands folded on the table. "No," I told Owen. "But they should be." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned back to his console and went back to work. He did not ask any more questions. He trusted me. That trust sat on my shoulders like something heavy and necessary, the way good responsibility always does. Outside, the Vreth fleet continued to pulse with its red and violet lights, patient and certain, like a predator that had already stopped thinking of the hunt as uncertain. I watched it. I checked the clock. 71 hours and 14 minutes remained on their deadline. I drank my coffee, which was, as always, terrible. And I waited. The archives do not make for exciting reading. Nobody writes thrillers about 40 years of quiet budget allocations and classified engineering projects buried under bureaucratic language. But if you know what you are looking for, if you know how to read between the lines of dry government reports filed in the middle of the night, the picture they paint is breathtaking. I first saw the full picture 2 years before the Vreth fleet arrived at Earth. Admiral Shinobi called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon and handed me a physical folder. Not a digital file. A physical folder, sealed with 3 layers of authentication that required my biometrics and hers simultaneously to open. I remember thinking that was unusual. The Admiral was not a dramatic person. If she was using physical documents and dual authentication seals, she considered what was inside worth protecting from every network that could theoretically be monitored. The folder was labeled with a simple name. Project Pale Rider. "Sit down, Yael," she said. She never used my first name unless she wanted me to understand that what followed was personal, not procedural. I sat down. What I read over the next 4 hours rearranged my understanding of everything I thought I knew about humanity's military posture in the galaxy. The official story, the one the Galactic Council believed, the one every diplomatic report and trade agreement had carefully maintained, was that humanity was a young, somewhat scrappy spacefaring species that was still catching up technologically. We had managed to develop faster-than-light travel, basic energy shielding, and a respectable but limited defensive fleet. We were behind the curve compared to established galactic powers. We knew it. They knew it. Our role in the galaxy's power structure was that of a probationary member, watched carefully, limited deliberately, permitted to exist because we had not yet caused enough trouble to warrant removal. That story was a construction. It had been built carefully, maintained at enormous cost, and it had been working exactly as intended for 4 decades. The truth began in 2189, 18 months after the first contact skirmish with the Vreth Dominion. We lost 11 ships in that encounter. The Vreth lost none. They had not been trying to destroy us. They had been sending a message about the hierarchy of things, demonstrating their capability gap, establishing, in terms they assumed we would understand, that we were not their equals. They were right, at the time. What they did not understand was what humans do when we feel outgunned. We do not accept it. We obsess over it. We take it apart, study every piece, and then we work. We work with a focus that borders on something that would frighten a calmer species if they could see it. We do not rest until the gap closes. And then we keep working after the gap closes, just to make sure. General Arthur Blaine, who had led the defense forces during the skirmish, presented a classified proposal to the unified Earth government 6 weeks after the battle. The proposal was 312 pages long. He had written it in 6 weeks, and it was 312 pages long. That alone should have told everyone what kind of person he was. The proposal argued that humanity's only long-term security lay not in diplomacy, not in alliances, and not in the goodwill of the Galactic Council, but in overwhelming and undeniable capability that no potential aggressor would ever want to test. It argued further that the best version of this capability was one that no potential aggressor knew existed. He called it the doctrine of prepared silence. Show nothing. Prepare everything. Wait. The government approved the proposal in a closed session that officially never happened. Pale Rider was the result. For 40 years, operating under 17 different cover names and buried inside a dozen legitimate infrastructure projects, Earth quietly built what Arthur Blaine had envisioned. The generation ships that appeared in public records as deep colonization vessels were, in reality, autonomous carrier killers. Their outer configuration matched every published specification. Their internal architecture was something else entirely. Owen was reading the summary files I had authorized for his clearance level. He had been reading quietly for 20 minutes when he set down the tablet and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something between professional admiration and genuine unease. How did we hide the power signatures? He asked. Those ships would need a reactor output that doesn't match the colonization vessel profile. Phased construction, I said. The weapons systems were installed in the final 6 months before each ship went active, after all the inspection windows had closed. The reactors operate on a modulated output that reads as normal during standard scans. Full power only activates on a command code that was never transmitted on any monitorable frequency. He was quiet for a moment. And the crew? Volunteers. Every single one. Selected through a screening process that took 2 years per candidate. They have been running silent in deep space for varying periods, some as long as 4 years. No active communications. No identifiable engine signatures. They move slow, and they move dark. How many ships? 314. He stared at me. 314, he repeated. None of them are on any public registry. None of them appear in any budget allocation that an outside auditor could find without spending a decade looking. They are ghosts. There was something else in the files that I had known about for 2 years but that still made my chest feel strange when I thought about it. A Vreth intelligence officer, a low-ranking one with access to mid-level tactical doctrine files, had defected to human space 11 years ago. Her name was difficult to pronounce in any human language, but she had chosen the name Nell for herself after arriving, because she found it simple and honest, and she said she liked simple and honest things after spending 30 years inside the Dominion. Nell had spent 3 years talking to our intelligence teams. She had handed over, piece by piece, the tactical doctrine that the Vreth used to manage large fleet engagements. Their formation strategies. Their shield cycling patterns. Their blind spots. The specific angles at which their defensive geometry was weakest under kinetic impact. The frequencies on which their command ships coordinated during combat, and the 2-second lag their communication protocol introduced between a detected threat and the fleet-wide response order. 2 seconds. In space combat, 2 seconds is enough. Every lesson Nell gave us had been fed, over the following years, into the targeting systems of the Pale Rider vessels. The targeting intelligence had been trained on Vreth doctrine the way a chess player trains on an opponent's recorded games. It knew every preferred opening. It knew every habitual response. It knew where the holes were. Nell had been given a small house outside of Edinburgh. She grew tomatoes. She said they were the most patient thing she had ever learned to care for, and that she found patience much easier when nobody was threatening to end her world. I thought about her often in those hours. Clara Hobbs had been cleared for a deeper layer of the Pale Rider files than Owen, and she came to find me at my station late in the second hour of the night cycle, when the deck was quieter and the rest of the crew was running on adrenaline and focus and the particular kind of calm that comes from being too committed to a course of action to entertain fear. "The power relay checks are done," she said. She was not talking about the station's power relays. She was talking about the pre-activation confirmation she had been waiting to receive, transmitted via a communication method so obscure and low bandwidth that it looked, to any outside observer, like background radiation interference. "All 14 confirmation nodes?" I asked. "All 14. I nodded. I let out a breath. Pale Rider was awake. The fleet was in position. 314 vessels, dark and cold and patient, had been repositioning over the last 11 days. Moving by degrees. No sudden trajectory changes. No burn signatures worth flagging. They had drifted, very slowly, like debris, like nothing, into the space behind and around the Vreth formation. They were not behind every Vreth ship. They were behind the specific ships that Nell's doctrine files identified as the command vessels, the shield generation hubs, the fleet coordination nodes. The nervous system of the Vreth fleet. The Vreth fleet of 5,000 ships did not know that 314 human vessels were sitting inside their own formation, waiting. In 11 days of positioning, not one Vreth sensor had flagged them. Our ships were running cold, using passive drift for movement, with active systems at the lowest possible threshold. We had studied every scan frequency the Vreth used and designed our heat signature profiles to fall below their detection floor. Arthur Blaine had been dead for 7 years. I wished, not for the first time, that he could have been in the room for this. Ben Holt came up beside me and quietly placed a printout on my console. It was a detailed breakdown of the Vreth command ship positions relative to Pale Rider vessel locations. He had been calculating intercept angles and engagement windows without being asked. He had simply understood what was needed and had done it. "Optimal engagement window opens in approximately 49 hours, he said. "It stays optimal for a window of about 6 minutes. 49 hours. That left 22 hours on the Vreth deadline. Which meant the last thing the Vreth would see, before everything changed, was humanity asking for more time. I looked at the fleet outside. I looked at the flagship, enormous and arrogant in the dark. They had come here believing they understood us. They had assessed us, categorized us, decided we fit neatly into the pattern of every other species that had folded under their pressure. They had not considered the possibility that we had spent 40 years preparing for exactly this moment, because the thought had simply not occurred to them. That, I had come to understand, was not their failure of intelligence. It was their failure of imagination. And imagination, as it turned out, was one of the things we were very, very good at. Hour 71 began at 0400 station time. I had slept 4 hours in the chair at my station. It was not good sleep. It was the kind of sleep you manage when your brain refuses to fully let go of what is coming but your body insists on at least a minimum of rest. I woke up with a stiff neck and a clarity that felt almost physical, sharp and clean and cold. Owen was still at his console. I do not think he had slept at all. His eyes were focused and his posture was straight, the way it gets when a person is running on something other than rest, running on the awareness that this is a moment that does not repeat. Grace Farrow had the comm systems on full monitoring. Every broadcast from the Vreth fleet, every council observation channel, every automated frequency that carried any signal at all, was being recorded, filtered, and analyzed. She had flagged 12 communications of interest in the last 6 hours. None of them changed anything we were planning. The Vreth fleet had settled into a holding pattern. They were comfortable. They expected the deadline to pass, expected Earth to broadcast either capitulation or desperate defiance, and expected their response to either option to be simple. Ben Holt handed me the final engagement window confirmation at 0412. The window opened in 3 hours and 14 minutes. At 0500, I authorized the transmission of Earth's second formal communication to the Vreth fleet. It was a ceasefire proposal. It requested an immediate halt to all tactical posturing, proposed a 6-party mediation framework involving neutral council species, and included 14 pages of supporting documentation regarding human territorial rights under the council's own charter. It was meticulous. It was thorough. It was the kind of communication that demanded to be read carefully, that required attention and consideration, that created the natural expectation of a waiting period. High Admiral Venkata received it. I know because his staff sent an automated acknowledgement within 11 minutes. Then nothing. They were reading it. Or they were ignoring it while appearing to read it. Either way, they were still. They were holding position. That was all we needed. At 0621, I sent a single 3-word message on an encrypted channel to a frequency that only one person in 314 ships was monitoring. The message was, Pale Rider. Now. There was no countdown. There was no dramatic announcement on the command deck. I did not stand up or raise my voice. I sent the message and I set the tablet down and I looked out at the Vreth fleet and I waited, because the next 6 minutes would tell us whether 40 years of preparation had been enough. The first indication that something was happening came from Grace Farrow. Vreth command frequencies are spiking, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Multiple simultaneous emergency broadcasts across all fleet coordination channels. Then Clara Hobbs, power readings from Sector 7 of the Vreth formation are dropping. Significant drop. Something large just lost primary power. Then Ben Holt, who was watching the sensor feeds with both hands on his console, we have impacts. I am counting impacts on 17 separate Vreth vessels. Kinetic signatures. No energy discharge from our side, no plasma, no beam weapons. Just impact. Kinetic weapons. Rods of dense composite material, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, guided by targeting systems that knew exactly where the Vreth armor was thinnest and exactly where the critical systems sat behind that armor. Silent, invisible until impact, carrying no detectable energy signature in flight. Nothing to shoot down. Nothing to intercept. Just physics. The command deck of our station went completely quiet. Not the quiet of fear. The quiet of people watching something enormous happen, something they had prepared for but that still, in the actual moment of it, exceeded what they had been able to fully imagine. The Vreth fleet's response, as Nell had told us, took 2 seconds from detection to fleet-wide defensive broadcast. In those 2 seconds, 9 Pale Rider vessels had already completed their initial engagement sequence and were moving to secondary targets. The Vreth command ship's shields came up. They came up facing the directions that the Vreth tactical doctrine prioritized in a surprise engagement, the directions their historical doctrine said threats came from. Not the directions our ships were coming from. 43 Vreth vessels sustained critical damage in the first 4 minutes. The Pale Rider fleet was not fighting to destroy. It was fighting to disable. The targeting was precise, focused on propulsion, on weapons arrays, on the communication relays that held the fleet's coordination together. A Vreth fleet that could not coordinate was not a fleet. It was 5,000 individual ships, each making its own decisions in chaos. Chaos is very difficult to fight effectively, no matter how large you are. At the 4-minute mark, the Vreth flagship went dark. Not destroyed. The flagship was too heavily armored to disable quickly without dedicated firepower that we had committed elsewhere. But its primary communication relay, the single point through which High Admiral Venkata was coordinating his fleet's response, had been hit by 3 simultaneous kinetic strikes from angles the flagship's design had never accounted for. The Admiral could still see. He could not talk. A fleet without a voice is not a fleet. It is noise. The Galactic Council's observation vessel, a civilian craft sitting at the edge of the engagement zone, had gone completely silent 40 seconds into the engagement. Their translator system, which automatically rendered any received broadcast into 17 Council languages, had apparently defaulted to broadcasting its processing output on open comms. For 40 seconds, the galaxy heard the machine say, in 17 languages simultaneously, "This is unprecedented. This is unprecedented. This is." Grace flagged it with a timestamp. I told her to save the full recording. At the 5-minute and 40-second mark, High Admiral Venkata managed to restore partial communications through a backup relay that we had not prioritized for targeting because Nell had not listed it in her doctrine files. It was an older system, narrowband, not suited for fleet coordination, but it was enough for the Admiral to transmit one thing. He transmitted a recall order. The Vreth fleet began to withdraw. Not retreat in the sense of running. They were still organized enough to maintain formation integrity as they pulled back. They still had roughly 4,000 ships in functional condition. They still outmassed us by an order of magnitude. But they were leaving, and that fact, the simple, enormous fact of it, filled the command deck with something I did not have a precise word for. Not celebration. Not relief. Something bigger than both of those. The feeling of a thing being proven true. 62 Vreth vessels were disabled and drifting. 11 were destroyed, not by design but because critical systems had failed in ways that created cascading damage beyond what our targeting intended. The Pale Rider fleet reported its losses at the conclusion of the engagement. 11 crew members across 3 vessels lost when a Vreth point defense system managed to target one of our ships in the final minute. 22 vessels sustained minor damage. 2 sustained significant structural damage but remained operational. We had engaged 5,000 ships. 11 people lost their lives, and I will carry every name. Owen put the casualty report on my console without a word. He stood beside me while I read it. There was nothing to say that fit the moment. There rarely is, when the arithmetic of survival is tallied and you have to hold both the victory and the cost of it in the same thought. The Vreth fleet's final transmission, before it completed its fold space transition out of Earth system, came from Vrenkata's flagship through the restored backup relay. It was 6 seconds long. Grace translated it from the Vreth command dialect in real time. The Admiral said, in the formal register of the Dominion's highest military language, the single word that translates most accurately into English as, impossible. I looked at it on the screen for a long time. Then I finished my coffee, which had gone completely cold. The council chamber was not what I expected. I had seen images of it, of course. Everyone had. It appeared in every historical broadcast about the founding of the Galactic Council, in every documentary about interstellar diplomacy, in every piece of promotional material the Council had ever produced. It was designed to impress. 300 meters in diameter, a perfect sphere carved from a material that was translucent and seemed to contain, somehow, the light of distant stars within its walls. The seating arrangement rose in concentric rings, 500 delegate positions occupied by representatives of 47 species, each with their own translation arrays, their own ambient atmospheric adjustments, their own protocols of address and deference. I walked in alone. No aide. No security detail. No second officer at my shoulder. Just me, in my dress uniform, which was dark blue with a single silver insignia at the collar and absolutely no ornamentation beyond that. I had been offered a formal escort by the Council's own protocol office. I had politely declined. Every set of eyes in that chamber, and there were many eyes, of many different kinds, in many different configurations, on many different kinds of faces, tracked me as I walked from the entrance to the central address position on the chamber floor. Some of those gazes were hostile. Some were curious. Some, and I noticed this clearly, were something I had not expected to see in the faces of species that had been part of this council for centuries. They were relieved. Ambassador Quelsier sat in the council chair that corresponded to his species' position in the hierarchy. The Quell were tall, blue-gray, with a stillness to their movements that made them look perpetually patient, as if they had all the time available in the universe and saw no reason to rush any of it. Quelsier had held his position for 40 years. He had seen species rise and fall, alliances form and dissolve, crises that seemed monumental become footnotes. He was not, I had been told, easily unsettled. He looked unsettled. I stood at the center of the chamber and I waited for the formal opening of the address session. The Council's presiding officer, a small, precise creature from a species called the Aura, called the session to order in a voice that was surprisingly loud for something so physically compact. Formalities were observed. My credentials were read into the record. My right to address the full assembly was confirmed, and then reconfirmed, because several delegations had apparently filed procedural objections to my presence that needed to be formally dismissed before we could proceed. I waited through all of it. There was no hurry. The Vreth fleet was not coming back. I was in no danger in this room. I had nothing to prove by displaying impatience. When it was finally my turn to speak, I spoke simply. 3 days ago, I said, the Vreth Dominion brought 5,000 warships to Earth and demanded our surrender within 72 hours. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think precision matters here. We did not beg. We did not run. We did not capitulate. We defended ourselves, and we did so with measured force targeted at military assets only. When the Vreth fleet began its withdrawal, we stopped. That is the complete account of events. The chamber was very quiet. Quelsier leaned forward very slightly. Commander Moran. The Council requires an explanation of the capabilities you employed. They were not declared. They were not disclosed under any of the relevant treaties. Humanity represented itself, in every diplomatic communication for 40 years, as a species with a significantly more limited military posture. We represented ourselves as non-aggressive, I said. That was true. We were not aggressive. We never fired first. In 40 years of developing the capabilities you saw deployed, we never used them against anyone. We built them. We kept them ready. And we used them only when 5,000 enemy ships appeared in our sky. The deception of the Council, said a delegate I recognized as representing the Morathi Collective, a species that had been a significant trading partner of the Vreth for 2 centuries, is a serious violation of the Council's foundational transparency protocols. I would be interested, I said carefully, in the Council's analysis of the transparency protocols as they applied to the Vreth's preparation of their fleet over the last decade. I have a significant amount of intelligence on that subject, if the Council would like to review it. The Morathi delegate went quiet. Quelsier's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly. He was reassessing. I could see it. He had come into this session with a framework in his mind, humanity as the defendant, the Council as the authority, the outcome as a negotiation in which humanity would make concessions in exchange for continued existence. He was revising that framework in real time. You did not destroy the Vreth fleet, said a voice from the upper tier of the chamber. I looked up. The delegate was from the Morathi, a species I knew primarily from trade reports and a historical document about the early Council years. They were small, pale, bird-like, and they had been very quiet throughout the session so far. You could have. You chose not to. Yes, I said. Why? I looked at the delegate for a moment. The question was genuine. They actually wanted to know. Because destroying them was not the goal, I said. The goal was to demonstrate that attacking Earth was a decision with consequences that the Vreth, and anyone watching, would remember. We are not interested in being feared. We are interested in being left alone. Those are different things. The chamber was quiet again for a few seconds. Then Quelsier said, "You hid your capabilities for 4 decades. How do we know you are not hiding others?" "You do not," I said. "And that is, I think, precisely how it should be. You have spent 40 years assuming you understood what humanity was capable of because we told you what we were capable of. Today I am suggesting a different approach. Treat us as you would treat any species whose full capabilities you cannot independently verify. With respect. With fairness. And without threatening us." Another silence. This one longer. "Your terms," said Quelsier. He said it like a man preparing to read a long list of demands that he already found unpleasant. 3, I said. Just 3. First, the Council formally rescinds Resolution 1119 and every similar resolution that provides a legal framework for what the Vreth called corrective action. No species should be permitted to threaten another with extinction for territorial noncompliance. That is not law. That is coercion with paperwork. I heard something shift in the upper tiers of the chamber. Movement. Adjustments in posture. The sound of species that had been waiting a long time to hear those specific words said in public, in a formal session, on the record. Second, I continued, humanity retains full sovereignty over our settled worlds and our exploration corridors, with the same rights and protections afforded to any established Council member. We are not probationary. We are not supervised. We are equal members. Quelsier's jaw tightened very slightly. And the third? Mutual defense, I said. Any species that is threatened with corrective action by another Council member may request human assistance. We will evaluate each request on its merits. We are not offering to be anyone's protector. We are offering to be a neighbor that actually shows up. The silence that followed my third term lasted 11 seconds. I counted them, exactly as I had told Owen I would. The Morathi delegate stood up. It was not required. Standing was not part of the council's formal procedure for seconding a proposal. They stood anyway, in the quiet of the chamber, and every eye in the room went to them. The Orati Collective formally seconds all 3 terms, they said, and requests that they be entered into the permanent record. A beat of silence. Then, from the tier above the Orati, another delegate stood. The Shinvara. I had not expected that. The Shinvara had been council members for 300 years. They were cautious, traditional, slow to align with any position that deviated from established precedent. They stood anyway. Then 4 more. Then 7. Quelsier sat very still through all of it. He was a political creature, which meant he was very good at counting. He was counting right now. I could see it in the way his gaze moved across the rising delegates, adding, calculating, arriving at a number that told him something he did not want to know. He looked back at me. You understood, he said quietly, not through the formal address system, just across the space between us, that you were not the only species waiting for this. I suspected, I said. I did not know for certain until I walked into this room and saw who was relieved. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he looked down at his console and began the formal process of recording the session's outcomes. It was, in the end, not a fight. It was a conversation that 40 years of quiet work had made possible. And the room, which had been designed to impress and to intimidate, felt suddenly much smaller and much more honest than it had when I walked in. I did not sleep on the transport back to Earth. I had been awake for 39 hours by the time the shuttle broke atmosphere and the blue-white curve of the planet filled the viewport. I had a bed available. I had been told, politely but firmly, by the transport's medical officer, a young man named Gordon Wells who was 23 years old and extremely earnest about his responsibilities, that I should sleep. I told him I would. I did not. I sat and I watched the planet come closer, and I thought about the letter I had never sent. It was still on my personal device. I had written it 8 months ago, in the early hours of a morning when I could not sleep and the weight of what was coming had settled on me in a way that required me to put words somewhere. I had written it to Admiral Patricia Chinobi, who was, at the time, in the medical wing of Earth Station recovering from the heart surgery that the doctors had been telling her she needed for 3 years before she finally agreed to have it. I had written her 5 pages. About Pale Rider. About the fleet. About what I thought was going to happen, and what I hoped, and what I feared. About the fact that none of it would exist without her, without the 30 years she had spent pushing and fighting and refusing to let the project die when funding dried up or when political winds shifted or when the Council's latest diplomatic outreach made some people wonder if we were building something we would never need. She had died before I finished the letter. A second surgical complication, 7 weeks after the first procedure. It had been sudden. She had been improving, and then she was not, and then she was gone. I had been on duty when the notification came through on my personal channel. I had read it, and I had put the device in my pocket, and I had gone back to work, because there was work to do and she would have been furious with me for anything else. The letter was still unfinished. I had not been able to add the ending to it. The ending required knowing how things turned out, and I had not known how things would turn out, and then by the time I knew, the letter felt somehow too late. Like sending news to someone about the outcome of a race they had spent their whole life running. Gordon Wells came and stood beside my seat and did not say anything about sleep this time. He just handed me a cup of tea and went back to his station. The tea was not bad. It was, in fact, considerably better than the coffee on the command deck. I made a note to say something to him about it. Earth grew larger in the viewport. The official broadcast of the Council's session outcomes had been public for 6 hours by the time we landed. The news had reached Earth well before I did. I had not prepared for what I found when the shuttle doors opened. There were people outside the landing platform. Not a crowd that had been organized or invited. People who had simply come. They had come in the night, from the city and from further out, and they stood in the cold morning air of the southern English coast and they watched the shuttle land and they did not cheer the way you see in old films, in grand dramatic moments. They were quiet. Some of them were crying. Some of them were simply standing, with their faces turned toward the shuttle, with expressions that I did not know how to describe precisely except to say that they looked like people who had been afraid for a very long time and had just, in the last few hours, been given permission to breathe. I did not stop to speak. I was not prepared for speaking. I nodded to them, I held up my hand, I kept walking, because the alternative was standing still in the middle of an airfield and feeling things too large for a public setting. Captain Lena Doyle, who had commanded one of the Pale Rider vessels, a ship called the Alderton's Run, was waiting for me inside the terminal building. She had flown in from the fleet's rendezvous point. She was 40 years old, dark-haired, with a calm that I recognized as the particular calm of someone who had been through something significant and had not yet decided how to put it into ordinary language. She handed me a data chip. Crew logs from all 314 ships, she said. Complete records. Personal entries, technical logs, engagement records. They wanted you to have them. All of them. I said. Every one, she said. Some of the entries go back 4 years. The people on those ships have been waiting a long time to hand this over to someone. I put the chip in my pocket next to my personal device. Next to the letter that I had never sent. We drove north, along the coast. It was early morning, and the light was the kind of low-gray light that the English coast specializes in, beautiful in a quiet way that does not advertise itself. The sea was visible between the hills. My brother, Nathan, met me at the door of the house he had been keeping ready for me. He was 44 years old and had spent his career as a marine biologist, studying things in the ocean that most people forgot existed. He had followed the news the way everyone else had, with the same gap between what was reported publicly and what was actually happening, because I had never been able to tell him the classified version. He had trusted me anyway. He handed me a sandwich and did not say anything about the fact that I looked like I had slept in a chair for a total of 4 hours in the last 3 days. The sandwich was very good. I told him so. He looked pleased. I walked out to the cliff in the early afternoon. The light had changed, the gray pulling back to reveal something pale and silver over the water. The sea moved below me in long, slow waves. A cold wind came off the water and I stood in it and let it hit my face. I thought about what the Orati delegate had asked me in the council chamber. Why did you stop? You could have destroyed them. You chose not to. I had given her the practical answer, the strategic one, because that was the appropriate answer for a formal address to the full council. But standing on the cliff with the wind coming off the sea and nobody listening, I could afford to think about the real answer. We stopped because stopping was always the plan. Not because we lacked the capacity to do more damage. Not because we were afraid of what would happen if we continued. We stopped because what we had done was sufficient, and sufficient was the line we had drawn for ourselves before any of it began. The goal was never to prove that we could devastate them. The goal was to prove that we could. That we had chosen not to. That the choice was ours, and that we were capable of making it even in the middle of a battle, even when the momentum of the thing pulled hard toward more. That second part, I had told the council, matters more than the first. Standing on the cliff, I believed that completely. I took out my personal device. I opened the letter to Patricia Chinobi. I read through the 5 pages, which had not changed, which were still waiting for an ending. Then I started writing again. I told her about the engagement. I told her about the council chamber and the delegates who stood up, and the expression on Quelsier's face when he understood what was happening. I told her about Gordon Wells and his excellent tea, and about the people standing on the airfield in the cold morning, and about the data chip in my pocket full of 4 years of crew logs from people who had been running silent and dark and patient in deep space, waiting for a moment they were not even certain would come. I told her about Nathan's sandwich. I told her that 3 minor species had submitted requests for mutual defense consultations within the first 48 hours of the council announcement, and that our diplomatic office was currently staffed by 11 people and was going to need considerably more than that very soon, and that she would have found this deeply funny. I told her that I had put her name first in the official victory register. Her name, and then the 11. I told her that the galaxy had learned 2 things on the day we responded. That humans could be ruthless when pushed far enough. And that we would stop when we said we would stop. Then I wrote the line that I had been circling around for 8 months, the line I had not known how to put down because it required knowing the outcome and the outcome had not yet been certain. I wrote, you told me that the Vreth would do this, or someone like them would, and you were right, and everything you built was there when we needed it, and what comes next is going to be very hard and very complicated and we're going to do it anyway because that is what we do, and I think you already knew that. I saved the letter. I did not send it, because there was nowhere to send it. But saving it felt like finishing something. The wind came off the sea and the pale silver light moved on the water. I stood there for a long time. 3 weeks after the council session, I received a personal message from the ORT delegate, whose name I was slowly learning to pronounce correctly. She wrote in careful, formal English, which she had apparently been studying for 2 years because she had anticipated that English might become useful to know. She said she was looking forward to the implementation of the mutual defense framework, and that the ORT had waited for a long time for a neighbor that actually showed up. She said something else at the end of the message that I have kept, the same way I kept Grace Farrow's timestamp on the translator broadcast, the same way I kept the recording of Quelsier's quiet observation at the end of the council session. She wrote, "We watched humanity for a long time. We were afraid you would be like the others, or afraid you would be nothing at all. We did not expect you to be something new." I read that line 3 times. Then I called Nathan and told him I was staying for another week. He said the house was mine for as long as I needed it. He asked if I wanted to come down to the shore in the morning and look at tide pools with him, because he was documenting a species of bioluminescent urchin that very few people had ever seen, and he thought I might find it interesting. I said yes. They called what we did speechless. A moment without words. And maybe that is the right word for it, for those 11 seconds in the council chamber, for the translator broadcasting in 17 languages simultaneously, for the Admiral's single impossible. Maybe silence is what happens when the universe encounters something it did not predict. But I think the more accurate description is simpler than that. We spoke. We spoke in the only language that the Vreth and the council had chosen to hear. And when they finally understood what we were saying, the conversation changed. Not because we broke them. Because we refused, at the moment when everything could have broken further, to break anything more than was necessary. That restraint, patient and deliberate and chosen freely under pressure, was not the ending. It was the beginning of something we did not yet have a complete name for. Something that would take years to build and would be difficult and complicated and worth every moment of the difficulty. I stood at the tide pools the next morning with Nathan, and he showed me the bioluminescent urchins. They were small and blue-green and they pulsed with light in the dark water under the rocks, entirely unbothered by the history of the last several weeks, simply being what they were. I thought about how much of the universe operated on exactly that principle. Being what it was. Doing what it did. Waiting for someone to finally pay attention. We had been paying attention for 40 years. We were not done.